practicing at Nanavati Hospital in Mumbai. So I primarily did my master's in social psychology from Mumbai University, and after that I did a second master's in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology from Chicago. Now, when I was doing my master's there, I somehow ended up in prison. No, I did not commit a crime. What happened was I volunteered at the Cook County Jail in Chicago. So when I was volunteering there at the prison, I did a lot of mental health screening. I did a lot of individual and group therapy, and that fascinated me so much so that I decided I'll come back to India and pursue my PhD in forensic psychology. So that's exactly what I did. I came back here and I pursued my PhD in forensic psychology. While I was doing that, what happened was I had to visit Thane Central Jail, Gerwada Central Prison, and when I went to these places during a routine visit for my data collection, I came across this inmate, and his story fascinates me to this day, and we call this inmate JD. All right. So JD was born and brought up in Mumbai in a middle class family to his parents. His father was, I think he was a clerk in a government office, and his mother was a homemaker. Now, growing up, JD had a very, very rough childhood because his parents were very, very controlling towards him, and they didn't have a good relationship between themselves either. Also, to make things worse, his father had extreme anger issues, okay, to such an extent that his father was emotionally and physically abusive towards his mother. So not only was JD dealing with problems at home, but also what happened was, given all this, he was also constantly bullied in school. Now, because of all these issues that he was dealing with, he developed this very strange concept or this very strange notion that women need to be controlled. That's what suddenly stuck in his mind, that women have to be controlled. And what happened was that this notion was also strengthened by the fact that the kids who bullied him in school were primarily women. So JD was, he was a very angry child growing up, and also he was a very thin, lanky kid, alright? So he couldn't physically take out his anger or frustration on either his parents or neither the kids who bullied him in school. So what he used to do was take out all his anger and frustration on animals. So for example, he used to kick his neighbor's dog, maybe hold kittens by their tails and dangle them upside down. So he was very, very cruel to animals. Now, eventually what happened was JD enrolled in an engineering college, just like you guys, alright? Now, when he went to this engineering college, he developed some really close friends who introduced him to drugs and alcohol. So primarily, he got hooked on to charas, ganja and alcohol. And it was exactly around that time that he even started visiting prostitutes. Okay, now, do you remember I told you he had this need to control women? So, that need to control women became so strong that he even became sexually and physically abusive towards these prostitutes. Later on, JD got married twice. He got divorced twice. Now, can you guys tell me what these issues were in his marriage? Exactly. Control issues. So he had problems with control, so he was very physically abusive towards both his wives, and also, you cannot forget, substance abuse issues. So he had a problem with drugs and alcohol also. Now, but when he actually got married for the third time, that time things literally took a dark turn. Okay, so what happened was one day JD came home extremely drunk. He was drunk out of his mind. He came home and he started fighting with his wife, and they got into such a serious argument that I think at that time, if I'm not mistaken, the ceiling of his house was being painted. So while it was being painted, all these appliances like the fans, the lights and all were taken off and kept on the floor at the side. The argument got so heated and so fiery that he completely lost control over his anger, his rage, and he picked up the bulb of the fan that was kept on the floor and just flung it on his wife's head. It hit his wife. She died instantly. Now, if that is not the worst part, she was pregnant with his child. JD is currently 36 years of age and he's serving a life sentence in prison. He's ruined his life. Now, when you think about this story, a lot of questions do come in my mind. Was JD genuinely a criminal at heart, or were there these circumstances that made him a criminal? Or more importantly, what influences people to commit crimes, and could JD's crimes have been prevented? Okay, so criminal and forensic psychology does tell us that yes, there are certain internal and external factors that do cause or influence people to commit crimes. So let's look at these factors one by one and see if they can answer some of our questions. Alright, factor number 1, biology. Now, if you go and see, this is the brain. Now, I'm just going to focus on two parts of the brain. You have the amygdala of the brain. That is the region that actually generates emotions. So you have emotions like happiness, anger, sadness, frustration. That is born, those emotions are born in the amygdala. And you secondly have the prefrontal cortex, which controls your emotional impulses. Alright, so how much anger, how much sadness, how much frustration is all controlled there. So usually what happens is, for a normal person, like hopefully I'm normal, so for a normal person like you and I, what happens is there is a very similar level of activities in both these areas of the brain. But research has said, or research has shown, that for a criminal, there is an overactivation of the amygdala and there is a lot of reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, because of which a person is more prone to rage, anger, violence. Now, if you all have noticed, JD had major anger issues. His father had major anger issues, alright? But if you go to see, is biology the only reason for a person to commit crimes? No, I don't think so. What also happens is there are different environmental factors also that influence people to commit crimes. Now, when you're talking about environmental factors, some of us or most of us have had pretty decent childhoods, like pretty good childhoods, even idyllic childhoods. But some of us are not that lucky. Alright, some of us go through unimaginable pain, trauma, horrors. And that is what brings us to our next factor, trauma. Now, when you talk about trauma, okay, research has shown that any criminals will go through 4 times the amount of traumatic events than non-criminals do. 4 times, and that's a lot. Okay, now, when we talk about trauma, it can mean different things for different people. But let's look at some common examples of what trauma can be. Abuse. Like I mentioned earlier, abuse can be physical, sexual, emotional. Negative social environment. By negative social environment, I mean people who are born in poverty, or people who are born in maybe neighborhoods which are filled with criminals and gangsters of sorts. Grief and loss. Grief and loss is when someone loses a loved one and can't get over that fact. Okay, and issues with substance abuse. I mean, that is, pretty obvious. Okay, now when you're talking about these things, again, going back to JD's story, we all knew that he was physically and emotionally abused as a child. The second trauma of his was also he was bullied in school by girls, if you guys remember, right? Okay, now there is absolutely no debate that substance abuse is related to criminal behavior in some way or the other. Talking about substance abuse, majority of the prison population has either ever in some point in their life has abused drugs or alcohol, has had a history with drugs or alcohol, or has committed a crime under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Okay? Now, what we know about substance abuse is maybe substances like alcohol will lower our inhibitions, and substances like cocaine over-excites our nervous system. Okay, and what that does is it definitely, destroys our ability to make decisions, or we lose our self-control. So when you speak about, again, JD, he also committed a crime under the influence, and if you all had noticed, he was dependent on drugs and alcohol right since his engineering days. Now, all these factors, the trauma, the substance abuse, the negative social environment, all of these will definitely impact a person's, mental capacity, mental health. So when you talk about mental illness, what does that do? See, a person with a mental illness does not necessarily make him into a criminal. But yes, if a person has a mental illness, he can be more prone towards having criminal tendencies. That is a proven fact in research. Okay? So when you are talking about mental illness, the most common mental illnesses seen in criminals are schizophrenia. Do you guys know what schizophrenia is? Yeah, schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, and antisocial personality disorder. Now, surprisingly, it is shown that a person who is a criminal has rated very, very high on the scale of depression, but will rate very low on an anxiety scale. That person does not feel worried, does not feel nervous, does not feel stressed, but he will rate very high on the scale of depression because of some traumatic factors or the other. Also, when you talk about antisocial personality, you all must have heard of the term sociopaths, psychopaths, right? So those come under the antisocial personality disorder, which again is the most common type of personality disorder that a criminal can have. Now, people with this antisocial personality disorder have no feelings, have no empathy, lack of concern for everyone. Okay, now when you talk about mental illness, any mental illness, any sort of mental health will bleed into one's personality. So I would like to talk about this personality theory, which is a very famous theory called the Eysenck's theory of personality. Now, what this famous psychologist Hans Eysenck said was every person, okay, criminal, non-criminal, has three main dimensions of personality. One is extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. What is extroversion means, when we say introverts versus extroverts. So an extroversion is someone who is extremely friendly, extremely outgoing, very social, will not like being alone, versus an introvert who is more tranquil, very passive, pessimistic probably. Yes, extroverts also will have maybe lack of inhibitions, they are optimistic, ingenuine, etc. The second trait is neuroticism. Now what neuroticism means, it means you have emotional stability versus emotional instability. A person who is more neurotic will be very prone to stress, anger, frustration, will be very reactive very quickly. Okay, so will be very exaggerated in their thinking, very over the top, like how you say, oh, she's a drama queen, that sort of a thing. Extremely high, very reactive, and they can't come down to, normal levels of emotionality quickly, that sort of a thing. So people who are more neurotic are prone to hysteria, depression, obsession, psychoticism. Basically, a person who is psychotic again will lack any sort of empathy for people, no concern or regard for other people, will not be able to form attachments quickly, and will definitely not have any impulse control, will be again very reactive very quickly. So the traits of a psychotic person will be, he'll be antisocial, violent, aggressive,
extremely again overreactive, extravagant. Now, when you look at a normal or an average person, most of the scales are balanced. Of course, sometimes there will be an imbalance in the scales because sometimes there are situations that arise which will cause an imbalance. That's absolutely fine. But when it comes to a criminal's personality, these scales will be completely over the top. The criminal will rate high on all three scales. On introversion, instability and self-control. None of that. Okay? When you talk about all these factors combined, including the personality theories, including all the factors we spoke about, what sort of ideas come to your mind? Any clues? Do you see how these factors can influence a person to commit crimes? Yeah. So, when you're looking at all these ideas, when you're looking at all these factors, my idea over here was not to scare you. My idea was not for you to say, oh my God, the person next to me is a criminal, or I'm going to be a criminal, or anything of that sort. The whole point was we need to be aware that there are these certain internal and external factors that can influence a person to commit crimes. Now, like you guys said, these questions have been answered. What influences people to commit crimes? But mostly, a very important question still stands. Could JD's behavior have been avoided? Could we have foreseen that he might behave this way? Could we have stopped his behavior? Now, the answer to this question is yes. It could have been stopped. How? By speaking up. Okay, now most of us, for example, let's say you have diabetes or you have a fracture. Won't you go to a doctor? Won't you seek help? Won't you speak up? You will. But most of us shy away from talking about mental illness. We don't go to a doctor. We don't take help. So that's the whole point. Why is there so much of stigma around trauma and mental illness? Why can't we talk about it as openly as you talk about physical illnesses? So, see, if silence is the real killer, this is one question that I really want to leave you all with. Are you all willing to speak up? Are you? Thank you.